Sneaky taxes. The bloody French and Indian War was finally over. But what if the Indians attacked again? Or what if Spain tried to invade? The British were still afraid of losing their colonies. So they decided to keep an army in America. 10,000 British soldiers, called Redcoats because of their red jackets, were sent across the ocean. 10,000 men ate a lot of food, and they wore out hundreds of pairs of shoes and suits of clothing. Who would pay for all their keep? The British said the colonists should pay. The British Parliament, which made laws for Britain and its colonies, passed the Quartering Act. It said that the colonists had to provide quarters, or places to live, for all the redcoats stationed in America. Then the British thought of another way to raise money from the colonies. They would enforce the Navigation Acts, which had been passed in the 1600s but never implemented. The Navigation Acts said that the colonists had to buy almost everything they needed from Britain, even when a product could be bought more cheaply from some other country. And not only that, they also had to sell almost everything they produced to Britain, even if they could get better prices somewhere else. It didn't seem fair, so people paid smugglers to bring in illegal foreign goods and to sell the colony's own goods to other countries. They did businesses with their butchers and bakers and their smugglers. When the British saw what was going on, they sent warships to patrol the American coast. Smugglers who were caught were fined and imprisoned. This made colonists angry. The Sugar Act made them even angrier. This act, or law, made it very expensive for the colonists to import one of their favorite products, molasses, or syrup. The Quartering Act, the Navigation Acts, and the Sugar Act seemed to the colonists like sneaky ways of making Britain richer at their expense. Why couldn't the British raise money at home? The British people were already heavily taxed. There was even a tax on windows, so poor people bricked up their windows to avoid paying the taxes. One day, a British customs officer seized a ship carrying an illegal cargo of molasses. He left some of his men in charge of the ship and went for help. When he returned, the cargo was gone. So were the ship's sails, anchors, and ropes. 40 armed men with blackened faces, he was told, had carried them off. In addition to providing soldiers with a place to live, the Quartering Act made colonists responsible for furnishing each redcoat with candles, fuel, salt, bedding, and beer. The Death Head Stamp. The Stamp Act of 1765 was the last straw. Parliament had passed a new tax. Now, every piece of paper that changed hands in the colonies, every newspaper, marriage license, will, diploma, and land deed, had to carry a British stamp before it could be considered legal. And the colonists had to pay for these stamps. People were furious. Riots broke out in Boston. In other cities, there were demonstrations and violent speeches against the British. To many, the Stamp Act seemed like the death of liberty. Americans didn't mind paying taxes to their local governments. That seemed fair because they elect their own representatives, but there was nobody to represent them in the British Parliament. The Stamp Act was taxation without representation. It could not be allowed. Groups of angry men formed bands called the Sons of Liberty. The Sons of Liberty would burst into homes of stamp collectors and warn them to resign. If a stamp collector refused, the Sons of Liberty threw rocks through their precious windows. Glass was very expensive. If he still held out, they smashed his house and all his belongings. Naturally, hardly any stamps were sold. Parliament finally gave in and replaced the Stamp Act. What wonderful news! Bells rang out in every city. People danced in the streets, they cheered and drank toasts to the good King George. Long live the king! They were sure the king was on their side. Now they thought America would be treated fairly at last. If a stamp tax collector refused to resign, he was sometimes chased out of town by a mob carrying clubs throwing stones. The colonists drew stamps with a skull and crossbones. This was to show their belief that the Stamp Act was a death of liberty. Who were the Sons of Liberty? They were groups of men opposed to Britain's treatment of the colonies. Some were poor, uneducated workers. Others were wealthy merchants, lawyers, and teachers. Not all of them believed in mob violence, but the threat of it scared their opponents. Ebenezer McIntosh, a shoemaker, led a gang that joined the Sons of Liberty. They tore down the houses of stamp tax collectors and other British officials. They were always ready for a fight. McIntosh ran among his men, shouting orders through his speaking trumpet.